The herbs that made it into the modern mainstream, lavender, chamomile, echinacea, peppermint, represent a small and somewhat arbitrary selection from a much larger tradition of plant-based medicine that flourished across Europe, Asia, and the Americas for centuries. The plants that didn't make the transition into contemporary wellness culture weren't abandoned because they stopped working. They were abandoned because supply chains, standardization requirements, and the economics of mass production favored the herbs that were easiest to grow at scale, easiest to market, and easiest to explain in 3 words on a label. The 13 herbs on this list didn't make that cut, and most of them deserve a second look. Agrimony has been used in European herbal medicine since at least the 1st century AD, when Pliny the Elder described it as one of the most important wound-healing plants in the Roman Pharmacopoeia. The name appears in Anglo-Saxon medical texts, in the herbals of the medieval monasteries, and in the writings of every significant European herbalist from the 10th century through the 17th, a span of consistent use that represents more accumulated observational data than most modern clinical trials can claim. The plant produces tall spikes of small yellow flowers in midsummer and grows in hedgerows, field margins, and disturbed soils with no encouragement whatsoever. Its primary medicinal applications in historical tradition were for digestive complaints, particularly the kind of sluggish digestion and mild liver congestion that manifests as bloating after meals, and for wound healing through its astringent tannin content. Modern phytochemical analysis has confirmed significant tannin, flavonoid, and bitter compound content in agrimony, which aligns directly with the traditional applications. Tannins explain the wound healing and astringent effects on mucous membranes. Bitter compounds explain the digestive stimulation, and the flavonoid content provides anti-inflammatory activity. German Commission E, one of the world's most rigorous herbal medicine regulatory frameworks, has approved agrimony for inflammation of the oral and pharyngeal mucosa, validating at least one of its traditional uses through modern standards. A tea made from the dried aerial parts, harvested when the plant is in flower and dried for a few weeks before use, is the traditional preparation, and the taste is pleasantly mild with a slight astringency that reflects the tannin content. Agrimony is the herb that treated wounds and digestive complaints through centuries of European use before simply falling out of fashion. A fate that reflects the economics of the supplement industry more than anything about the plant's actual value. If this kind of content speaks to you, subscribing keeps you here for everything we put out. There's a lot more of this coming. Meadowsweet carries a pharmaceutical history that most people walk past without realizing. The white-flowered plant that grows along stream banks and in damp meadows across Europe and Western Asia contains salicylates, the same class of compounds that gave the world aspirin. In the 19th century, chemists working with meadowsweet flowers isolated salicylic acid and used it as the starting point for synthesizing acetylsalicylic acid, aspirin, named partly after spirea, the old genus name for meadowsweet. The plant that gave rise to the world's most widely used pharmaceutical is now an ornamental considered by most gardeners who encounter it. Traditional European medicine used meadowsweet for exactly the applications aspirin is now prescribed for: pain relief, fever reduction, and inflammation, through the same underlying chemistry. Where meadowsweet differs from aspirin is in the buffering effect of its other compounds. The tannins and mucilaginous substances present in the whole plant appear to protect the stomach lining from the gastric irritation that isolated salicylic acid produces, which is why traditional herbalists used meadowsweet for stomach ulcers and gastritis, while the pharmaceutical derivative became notorious for causing exactly those conditions. The plant grows in reliably wet conditions, stream margins, pond edges, consistently moist low-lying beds, and produces masses of creamy white, almond-scented flowers that are harvested at peak bloom for tea or tincture. Meadowsweet is the plant that gave chemistry the starting material for aspirin, then got replaced by its own derivative. A historical irony that the plant itself seems to handle with considerable grace from the hedgerows where it continues growing undisturbed. Elecampane is a giant of the old European herb garden, literally producing basal leaves that can reach 2 feet long and flower stalks that grow to 6 or 8 feet by midsummer. And one of the most consistently documented respiratory herbs in the pre-modern medical tradition. The root, which is the primary medicinal part, contains inulin, the prebiotic fiber also found in chicory and Jerusalem artichoke, along with a group of sesquiterpene lactones, including allantolactone and isoallantolactone, that have demonstrated antimicrobial activity against bacterial species, including Mycobacterium tuberculosis, in laboratory research. Traditional use of elecampane root across European and Ayurvedic medicine focused on persistent coughs, bronchitis, and the chronic respiratory complaints that winter commonly produces and spring slowly resolves. The root was candied as a confection in 19th century England and sold as a sweet that was simultaneously a cough remedy, an approach to medicine delivery that modern pharmaceutical companies have spent considerable effort reinventing. Growing elecampane requires nothing beyond space. It is a vigorous, long-lived perennial that self-seeds readily and, once established, produces harvestable root from year 2 onward. The root is harvested in fall from second or third year plants, dried, and used as a decoction, simmered rather than steeped, because the dense root material requires more heat than leaf or flower preparations to release its compounds. Elecampane is the respiratory herb that was common knowledge in every European household medicine tradition for centuries and is now so thoroughly forgotten that most gardeners who accidentally grow it from a wildflower seed mix have no idea what they have. Wood betony was arguably the most important medicinal herb in Anglo-Saxon England. The herbals of that period list more conditions treated with betony than with almost any other plant, which is either testimony to its genuine versatility or evidence that the Anglo-Saxons were optimistic herbalists. The truth is probably somewhere between betony does have documented bitter compound content that drives genuine digestive and liver-stimulating effects, along with nervine properties that place it in the category of herbs that calm the nervous system through mechanisms that modern research has begun to characterize. Traditional applications included headaches, digestive sluggishness, nervous tension, and the kind of diffuse anxiety-adjacent state that pre-modern medicine described as disorders of the nerves, and modern medicine would call low-grade generalized anxiety. The plant grows in dry grassland, woodland edges, and the kind of thin, well-drained soil that many gardens have in abundance, producing spikes of bright purple-pink flowers that are genuinely ornamental. It is grown more often as a wildflower garden plant than as a medicinal herb, which means many gardeners who have it don't know it has any application beyond the visual. Dried betony aerial parts, steeped as tea, produce a mildly bitter, pleasantly complex drink that reflects the compound profile. Bitter compounds stimulating digestion, nervine compounds supporting relaxation, tannins providing mild astringency. Wood betony is the herb that was once considered so important it was planted by monasteries specifically for their medicinal gardens, and is now planted by wildlife gardeners specifically because bees like it, a demotion in status that says more about changing medical vocabularies than changing plant chemistry. Skullcap is one of the more pharmacologically interesting herbs on this list because the nervine properties that traditional North American herbalists documented in the 18th and 19th centuries have been partially validated through modern research on its primary active compounds. Baicalin and baicalin, flavonoids concentrated in the aerial parts of Scutellaria lateriflora, the American native species, show documented activity at GABA receptors and have demonstrated anxiolytic effects in animal models and preliminary human research. Traditional eclectic physicians, the 19th century American medical tradition that drew heavily on Native American plant knowledge, used skullcap specifically for nervous exhaustion, restlessness, and the anxiety-adjacent states that accompany prolonged stress. The plant grows in moist woodland margins and stream edges, producing small blue flowers that are easy to miss but reliably present through summer. American skullcap should not be confused with Chinese skullcap, Scutellaria baicalensis, which has a different compound profile and different traditional applications, though both are medicinally active. The aerial parts harvested when the plant is in flower and tinctured fresh in alcohol produce the most therapeutically active preparation. Dried skullcap loses volatile compounds relatively quickly, making tincture or fresh plant preparations preferable to dried herb tea for medicinal use. Skullcap is the nervine that North American indigenous medicine and 19th century eclectic physicians both reached for independently for nervous system support, a convergence that reflects genuine plant activity rather than borrowed tradition. Vervain has one of the longest and most cross-cultural medicinal histories of any herb in the Western tradition, appearing in Roman sacred rites, Druidic ceremony, Anglo-Saxon medicine, and the folk traditions of virtually every European culture that has left written records. The reverence attached to it was not purely ceremonial. The bitter iridoid glycosides in vervain produced documented bitter tonic effects on the liver and digestive system, and the nervine compounds give it a genuine calming action that traditional medicine consistently applied to nervous exhaustion, tension headaches, and the physical manifestations of chronic stress. Vervain differs from most nervines in being specifically associated with the type of person who takes on too much, works through exhaustion, and needs support for the physical depletion that sustained effort produces. A profile that the Bach flower tradition captured by making vervain one of its 38 remedies. The plant grows freely in disturbed soils, roadsides, and the edges of cultivated land, producing inconspicuous spikes of tiny lilac flowers that belie its historical importance. It is one of the least visually dramatic plants in a medicinal garden, and one of the most historically significant. A combination that probably explains why it has fallen out of common use. Dried aerial parts steeped as tea produce a noticeably bitter drink whose bitterness is itself part of the therapeutic mechanism, stimulating bile production and digestive enzyme activity through the reflex response that bitter taste receptors trigger. Vervain carried such cultural weight in the ancient world that Roman ambassadors wore it when negotiating peace treaties, which is either evidence of its genuine calming properties or the most ambitious herbal endorsement in recorded history. Motherwort's common name contains its primary traditional application, a uterine tonic and women's herb used across European, Chinese, and Native American medicine for menstrual irregularity, the anxiety that accompanies hormonal fluctuation, and the heart palpitations that both of those conditions commonly produce. The alkaloids and iridoids in Leonuris cardiaca have demonstrated uterine-stimulating activity in pharmacological research, confirming the traditional application, and the leonurin content shows documented cardiac effects, including mild heart rate reduction and antispasmodic action on cardiac muscle, that explain the plant's traditional use for the racing heartbeat that anxiety produces. The plant grows vigorously in disturbed soils, partial shade, and the neglected corners where most medicinal herbs refuse to establish, reaching 4 to 5 feet by midsummer and producing whorls of small pink flowers that pollinators visit constantly. Its uterine-stimulating activity makes it contraindicated in pregnancy, a precaution that traditional herbalists documented and that modern safety guidelines confirm. Motherwort is the heart and women's herb that European and Chinese medicine developed independently for overlapping applications, the kind of cross-cultural convergence that suggests the plant was doing something real enough to be noticed on 2 continents simultaneously. Fumitory, self-heal, mugwort, ground ivy, and sweet Sicily close this list as 5 herbs whose historical presence in the European medicinal tradition was significant enough that any serious herbalist of the 16th or 17th century would have grown them as standard practice, and whose current obscurity reflects not failed validation, but simply the narrowing of herbal knowledge that industrialization and pharmaceutical medicine produced over 2 centuries. Fumitory, with its delicate gray-green foliage and tiny pink flowers, was the standard liver herb of medieval Europe before milk thistle occupied that position. Its fumaric acid content drives genuine bitter tonic effects on liver and gallbladder function. Self-heal, which grows as a lawn weed across most of the temperate world without anyone recognizing it, contains rosmarinic acid and ursolic acid at concentrations that give it documented antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and wound-healing properties, a medicinal profile hiding in plain sight in every unmowed lawn. Mugwort has been used across European, Chinese, and Japanese medicine for digestive support and menstrual regulation for over 2,000 years, and its moxa use in traditional Chinese medicine, burning dried mugwort over acupuncture points, remains one of the most widely practiced physical medicine techniques in the world. Ground ivy, the creeping plant that edges every garden bed and appears in every lawn, was the primary lung herb of pre-modern Europe, used for coughs and upper respiratory complaints before being entirely displaced by more fashionable alternatives. Sweet Sicily, with its anise-scented leaves and hollow stems, was used as a natural sweetener for people who couldn't tolerate sugar, as a digestive tonic, and as a lung herb across Northern European traditions in a way that has left almost no trace in contemporary herbal practice. These 13 herbs represent the layer of botanical knowledge that sits just below the mainstream surface. Not lost exactly, but requiring the willingness to look slightly further back than the supplement aisle goes. The herbs that became famous did so through a combination of factors that had as much to do with commercial viability and cultural momentum as with medicinal superiority. The ones on this list were left behind by those same forces, not by their chemistry. Every plant covered here has a documented compound profile that explains what the people who used it for centuries were observing. Bitter compounds driving digestive effects, tannins producing wound healing and astringent action, nervine compounds modulating the nervous system, antimicrobial compounds addressing infection. The pharmacy aisle reflects which plants survived the transition to industrial medicine. These 13 reflect what existed before that transition, and most of it was working.